Welcome to Epic HFY Stories. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to check if you've subscribed to our channel. It's completely free, and subscribing will ensure that our stories show up more often in your feed. Mark Avery had never imagined that a routine maintenance run would end like this. He had been sent to Vilar 6, a remote moon so far off the charts that it didn't even come with a warning label. All he had expected was a dull inspection of a communications relay, a quiet night of instant noodles, and maybe a brief chat with an AI that was a little too judgmental. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the crash, the sharp jolt of the pod hitting the jagged surface, and the eerie silence that followed. As he crawled out from the twisted remains of his maintenance pod, Mark could barely stand. His side ached, and his head spun with disorientation. The air here was breathable, barely, but it tasted like metal, and something alien, something he couldn't quite place. Above him, the sky had a strange green hue, as if the atmosphere itself was sick, and the ground underfoot was cracked, rocky, and uninviting. Mark had only one thing on his mind: survival. He pushed himself up, eyes scanning the barren horizon, when something else caught his attention. A strange, spiny creature, like a cactus, but carnivorous, lunged at him, its sharp thorns aimed straight for his leg. Mark kicked at it, but the thing hissed, unfazed, and began to crawl closer, its mouth opening wide, ready to feast. He was too slow, too injured to do anything but brace himself for the inevitable. Then, out of nowhere, she appeared. A woman, tall and composed, wearing a tattered deep blue cloak that fluttered dramatically in the toxic breeze. She moved with an almost practiced grace, as though she had done this countless times before. Her long ears twitched, shimmering in the dim light, attuned to frequencies Mark couldn't hear. Before he could even react, she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the creature. In a single fluid motion, she delivered an uppercut, sending the cactus creature flying through the air like a discarded toy. It crashed into a nearby rock, its sharp spines no longer a threat. Mark blinked, staring at her in disbelief. His mind tried to catch up with what had just happened, the air still thick with the strange scent of the alien moon. He checked his oxygen levels, still full, and shook his head, almost not believing what he was seeing. "Are you hurt?" Her voice was smooth, like chilled metal, as if it had been forged in the vacuum of space itself. Mark took a deep breath, trying to maintain his usual light-hearted demeanor despite the bruises he could feel already forming. "Emotionally, always," he said with a weak grin. "Physically, my cracked ribs, bruised pride, and I think my spleen's upside down." The woman blinked slowly, staring at him with intense green eyes, her gaze unreadable. "You're a human?" she asked, as though trying to process this information. Mark's grin widened. "Last time I checked, which was yesterday. My mirror was a bit dusty, but yeah. Name's Mark Avery, crash survivor, engineer. Known to make excellent grilled cheese in zero gravity." She didn't laugh, didn't smile, didn't even seem to register his humor. She simply stared at him, her long, luminous ears flicking as she processed his words. "I am Zalara of Vanaril," she said flatly. Or rather, I was. Mark pushed himself upright, still a little unsteady. His eyes narrowed in confusion. "Vanaril? Wait, you mean like an alien diplomat? Or just some lost tourist who took a wrong turn on a road trip?" Zalara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned and began walking across the rocky terrain, heading toward a ridge where strange, bioluminescent moss flickered in the dark like some kind of eerie glow-in-the-dark paint. Mark, feeling the pull of survival instincts more than anything else, limped after her, still wincing with every step. "So, Mark called after her, trying to fill the awkward silence. "You live here? Like by choice? Or is this some sort of weird alien camping trip? Zalara paused, her silhouette sharp against the glowing moss. She glanced back at him, her face expressionless. I was exiled, she said simply, before turning and continuing her path. Mark blinked, a little taken aback. Exiled? Now this was getting interesting. He tried to keep up with her, his side throbbing with pain as he limped along. He wasn't sure whether to be amazed by her strength or confused by her calm demeanor. Either way, he wasn't going to survive out here alone. Exiled, huh? He said, trying to lighten the mood. Been there. Didn't make it through astronaut training the first time. Reckless disregard for safety protocols, jetpacks. Total nonsense. Zalara didn't even flinch at his attempt at humor. She just continued walking with that same unfazed poise, like she was made for this moon, and he was just a passing inconvenience. Mark groaned, clutching his side, but he had to admit the woman was starting to intrigue him, and given the circumstances, that might be the least dangerous thing about her. In Tierra Cave, night. They arrived at a small cave, surprisingly warm despite the harsh environment outside. The walls were alive with the glow of pulsing mushrooms and the occasional flicker of crystal formations embedded in the stone. It wasn't exactly luxury, but it was shelter, and at this point, that was all Mark needed. Zalara sat down near a shallow pool of steaming water, her posture as straight and poised as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Mark, on the other hand, collapsed onto a nearby rock, groaning as he eased himself into a sitting position. You don't happen to have a first aid kit, do you? Mark asked, his voice raspy. Or a med bot? Heck, I'd settle for a space lollipop at this point. Zalara didn't even look at him as she reached into the folds of her cloak and retrieved a small canister. With a twist of the top, she sprayed a sharp-smelling liquid onto Mark's side. He yelped in pain, wincing as the sting of the spray hit his bruises. That's some painful healing, Mark muttered. She glanced at him, her expression still unreadable. It is a biostimulant. It accelerates healing. Mark eyed her suspiciously. You sure you're not a bounty hunter sent to finish me off slowly? Zalara didn't answer, her face as still as ever. But in the silence, Mark swore he could feel something like consideration. Like she was weighing him, deciding whether or not he was worth the effort to keep alive. It wasn't much, but it was the most warmth he'd felt since crashing. Chapter 2. As the night stretched on, Mark stared at Zalara, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? And what kind of alien was she exactly? She had told him she had been exiled, but from what? Eventually, Zalara spoke again, breaking the silence that had settled over them. Her voice was low, almost contemplative. I was born without the mind light, she said, looking at him, her eyes glowing faintly in the soft light of the cave. My people consider it essential. Mark raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. Mind light? He asked, still trying to process the weight of her words. What, like some psychic link you all share? Zalara nodded. Yes, it's a psychic connection, one that all Venerians share, except for me. Mark laughed, despite himself. Well, I can relate. I was once the only guy at an engineering conference who didn't know what a quantum refractor coil was. Still don't. For the first time, a tiny, barely perceptible smile tugged at the corner of Zalara's lips. You are strange, Mark Avery, she said softly. Thank you, he said with a grin. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. Outside, Valor 6's second sun began to rise. Its pale green sliver bled through the thick clouds, casting everything below in a ghostly, surreal light. Zalara stood, retrieving a slender staff from behind a stone. It hummed with a soft, strange energy. "We are not safe here," she said, her tone shifting to something more urgent. Mark groaned, slowly pushing himself to his feet, still feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. "Of course they will, because I finally find a woman who talks to me, and the universe hates romance." Zalara glanced over her shoulder at him, her gaze blank but penetrating. "Romance? Never mind," he muttered, rubbing his side. "Lead the way." "Space legal?" Zalara's eyes narrowed for a moment, but she simply nodded, turning back toward the path ahead. And with that, Mark Avery, a man with no future, and Zalara, a woman with no past, began to walk together through the rocky landscape of Valor 6, toward a destiny neither could have imagined. The cave was quiet, but the soft hum of the bioluminescent mushrooms and the gentle bubbling of the shallow pool were oddly comforting. Mark couldn't help but notice how Zalara seemed completely at ease, as if this alien world, hostile and barren to him, was her natural habitat. She sat across from him, her posture still as impeccable as it had been when she first appeared. Her eyes, though, were no longer cold or distant. There was something more, calculating in them as she watched him, a glimmer of curiosity, maybe even something like concern. Mark, on the other hand, was exhausted. Every muscle in his body felt sore, each breath a little harder to take, the weight of his injuries pressing on him. But his mind was still buzzing with questions. "Okay, I think I can handle being stranded on a moon." "Barely," Mark muttered, rubbing his ribs with one hand. "But what I'm really wondering is, why you are here, exiled? I mean, you don't exactly look like someone who got the short end of the stick, if you know what I mean." Zalara didn't flinch at his question, didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Her long ears twitched, as if listening for something only she could hear. "I was exiled because I was born without the mind light," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a mix of bitterness and resignation. "My people cannot understand it. The mind light is the core of us. Without it, I am nothing." Mark blinked, processing the weight of her words. For all his wit, for all his sarcasm, he could feel the gravity of her silence. "So," he began cautiously, not sure how to phrase it without sounding insensitive. "You're like mentally disconnected? You don't feel anything?" Zalara's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Not disconnected. I can think, feel, but my people cannot hear me. I do not share their thoughts, their resonance." She paused, looking out at the shadows creeping along the walls of the cave. "I do not belong." Mark took a deep breath, not knowing how to respond. His life had been about machines, about fixing broken things, not about navigating the intricacies of alien cultures or the pain of being cast out. But in that moment, he realized something. Zalara, with her calm, composed exterior, was carrying a loneliness that made his own sense of isolation seem trivial by comparison. "Hey," Mark said, his voice softer than usual. "You're not alone. At least not right now." He cracked a weak grin, trying to lighten the mood, but it didn't seem to have much effect on her. She didn't smile back, but there was a faint shimmer in her eyes. Something like recognition. And for the first time, Mark felt like she might be seeing him, not just another human who had crashed on her planet. Before Mark could say anything else, a low, rumbling sound echoed from outside the cave, breaking the silence. Zalara's ears twitched, her body tensed, and she rose to her feet fluidly, as if she had been expecting this all along. "Predators will come," she said, her voice now laced with a sense of urgency. We must move. Mark scrambled to his feet, instinctively reaching for anything nearby to steady himself. Predators? What kind of predators? Alien lions, space wolves, or, I don't know, a space cactus that wants to eat me alive? Zalara's expression didn't shift. Worse, she replied simply, as though the situation was already decided. With no time to lose, she strode toward the entrance of the cave, her staff glowing faintly in her hand. Mark, still trying to keep up with her despite his injuries, hurried after her, feeling the strain in his body as he pushed through the pain. As they stepped out into the night, the environment felt even more alien. The sky, with its dim green hue, stretched endlessly above them, while the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The bioluminescent moss painted the landscape with an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the jagged rocks. Mark squinted into the distance, trying to follow Zalara's movements. So, what's the deal with these predators? He asked. Are they, dangerous? Or just overly enthusiastic about human meat? Zalara didn't answer right away. Her sharp eyes scanned the horizon, her ears flicking as if she were listening to sounds Mark couldn't hear. More dangerous than you can imagine, she finally said. They hunt in packs, and they do not fear death. But they will not attack unless they feel threatened. We must be careful not to draw attention. Mark groaned, suddenly wishing he were anywhere but here. So, no loud noises. Got it. I'll try to keep the vocal performance to a minimum. He winced as he took another step, his ribs reminding him that running wasn't exactly in the cards for him. The two of them moved through the rocky terrain, the quiet of the moon broken only by their footsteps, and the occasional eerie hum of the wind. The tension in the air was palpable. Mark kept his eyes on Zalara, watching the way she moved with such ease, so at home in this alien world. It struck him then just how out of place he was. Zalara, on the other hand, seemed completely unbothered. As they approached a steep ridge, she gave a quick glance back at him, her expression still unreadable. You are injured, she observed. You should rest. Mark couldn't help but laugh softly despite the discomfort. Sure, I'll rest right after I get out of this survival situation. I mean, if I don't die from the cactus bites first, then maybe I'll just go ahead and take a nap in the alien wilderness. Zalara didn't respond. Instead, she moved with the same fluid grace, leaping over the crevice in the rock with ease. Mark, still limping, managed to follow, his breath coming in sharp gasps. As they reached a plateau, Mark took a moment to glance around. The landscape was desolate, but there was something oddly beautiful about it. The stars above, though distant and cold, shimmered brightly, casting their faint glow over the moon's surface. For a moment, Mark forgot about the pain. He forgot about the crash. It was just him, this strange woman, and the alien world around them. And in that silence, something unexpected settled in his chest. Hope. Maybe Zalara was right. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. They continued walking. Mark didn't know where they were going, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next step he had to take. He was just following her, trusting that, in some strange way, she had a purpose for him. As they moved deeper into the wilderness of Valor 6, the distant sound of engines hummed in the air. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat. "What's that?" he whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. Zalara's ears twitched, and her eyes narrowed. "Someone is looking for us." Mark's stomach dropped. The predators were no longer the only threat they had to worry about. The sound of distant engines grew louder as Mark and Zalara moved swiftly across the barren landscape of Valor 6. The winds howled around them, kicking up fine dust and debris that stung their skin. Despite his injuries, Mark pushed forward, matching Zalara's pace as best he could. His ribs ached with every step, and his legs felt like they were made of lead, but he kept going. There was no other choice. Zalara, though, moved with effortless precision, her eyes darting from side to side, scanning the terrain with an intensity that Mark couldn't quite match. He had never seen anyone move like that. She was so at home here, while he felt like a stranger in a world that didn't want him. Eventually, they reached the entrance of a narrow cave, the mouth hidden behind a cluster of jagged rocks. The faint glow from the bioluminescent moss cast an eerie light over the opening, making it look like something out of a dream or a nightmare. Zalara motioned for Mark to follow her, then led the way inside. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, and the walls seemed to pulse with life. Crystals embedded in the stone flickered softly as they passed, and the sound of water trickling echoed through the narrow passages. The cave was alive in a way that Mark couldn't quite explain, as if it were more than just rock and stone, more than just an abandoned place. It felt aware. Mark couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. As they walked deeper into the cave, the temperature dropped, and he shivered involuntarily. Zalara moved ahead without hesitation, her every step sure, as though she knew exactly where she was going. Mark was left to follow, his footsteps heavier in comparison, his mind racing with questions. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the tension in the air made it hard to focus. "This is your idea of a safe place? A cave on a moon that's literally trying to kill me?" Zalara glanced back at him, her expression unreadable as usual. "It is the only place we can hide," she said simply. "And it holds something that may help us." Something about the way she said it made Mark pause. There was purpose in her tone, something he hadn't heard before. She wasn't just surviving. She was searching for something that could change everything. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds being their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the cave's ceiling. Mark tried to keep up, but his body was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion. The pain in his side throbbed with every step, and his vision was beginning to blur. Finally, they reached the heart of the cave, a large, open chamber, its ceiling high and dotted with strange, glowing crystals. In the center of the room, a pedestal stood, made of the same smooth, metallic stone as the walls. Resting upon it was a device, an intricate, alien-looking scanner, its surface covered in shifting symbols and glowing glyphs. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he stared at it. The device hummed with energy, its lights flashing in time with the pulsing vibrations in the air. There was something alive about it, as if it were more than just technology. It felt sentient. Zalara walked up to the pedestal and placed her hand over the device. The symbols on the scanner flickered, then shifted and twisted into new patterns. Mark watched in awe as the machine seemed to recognize her presence, as if responding to her in a way he couldn't quite understand. "You've seen this before, haven't you?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zalara nodded. "Yes. This is a scanner used to calibrate mind-light compatibility. It is used to measure the resonance of a person's thoughts, their ability to connect with Venerian technology." Mark's eyes widened. "So what? You think it's going to tell me if I'm some sort of psychic?" Zalara's expression softened just slightly, the faintest trace of something resembling humor in her gaze. "No, not psychic, but you may be more than just a human." Mark blinked in confusion. "What do you mean, more than human?" But before Zalara could respond, the scanner flickered again. The glyphs on its surface changed color, shifting from white to a strange iridescent green. pulsing in time with Mark's heartbeat. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, like the room was holding its breath. Mark's skin tingled, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Zalara moved closer, her eyes narrowed in disbelief as she studied the scanner. "This is not possible," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with a hint of fear. "The scanner should not be responding to you. It should have no reaction." Mark stepped back, his heart racing. "What the hell's happening? Is it broken or something?" Zalara's eyes locked onto his, wide with realization. "No, it's not broken." She took a step toward him, her voice low, almost reverent. "The scanner is acknowledging you." "Acknowledging me?" Mark repeated, his voice shaky. "What does that even mean? I'm just a guy who got stranded on your moon. I'm not some cosmic anomaly or anything." Zalara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a small metallic orb, its surface smooth and glowing faintly. She held it up to Mark, and he felt an odd pull toward it, as if it were calling to him. "This," she said, her voice filled with reverence, "is a core seed. Ancient Venerian technology. It was thought to be inert, but the fact that the scanner is reacting to you means it may be awakening." Mark took a step back, his eyes wide. "What? Are you saying that thing is going to attach itself to me or something?" Zalara didn't answer. Instead, she moved closer to him, holding the orb with an almost delicate reverence. Mark felt an odd chill run down his spine as she placed the orb in front of his chest. "Trust me," she said, her voice low and serious. "You may be more than you realize." Mark didn't have time to question her further. Before he could react, the orb suddenly floated from her hands and hovered just inches from his chest. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden burst of light, just a faint, almost imperceptible hum. Then, without warning, the orb dissolved into a stream of bright light, vanishing into his body. Mark gasped, stumbling back as the energy surged through him. He could feel it inside him now, this strange alien force vibrating beneath his skin, like his very molecules were shifting. "What did you do to me?" he whispered, clutching his chest. Zalara remained silent, her face unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, a flicker of awe in her eyes. She studied him carefully, as though watching him for any signs of change. "You have been bonded with the seed," she said softly, almost reverently. "It has chosen you." Mark staggered back, his head spinning. "Chosen me for what?" His heart raced as the light in his body pulsed once more, and a strange, unfamiliar energy flooded his senses. Zalara didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to the device, which was now glowing faintly, its symbols shifting in a complex pattern. There was a sense of urgency in her movements as she quickly began pulling open a hidden panel in the stone wall, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in a cradle of smooth stone, was another orb, larger than the first, glowing with a steady rhythmic pulse. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just a random guy stranded on an alien moon anymore. Something far bigger was at play. The air in the cave shifted. Mark felt it before he heard it. The subtle change in pressure. The way the ground beneath his feet seemed to hum with a strange energy. His pulse quickened, a sense of impending danger creeping up his spine. The orb, the core seed, inside him pulsed in response, like it was alive, aware of something Mark couldn't yet understand. Zalara didn't need to say anything. She had already turned toward the entrance of the cave, her eyes scanning the narrow opening, her body taut like a bowstring. The faint glow from the bioluminescent moss outside flickered erratically, casting long shadows that stretched into the cave like dark tendrils. "They're coming," Zalara said, her voice low, edged with urgency. She didn't explain further. There was no need. Mark could feel it now. The sound of distant engines, the rumble of thrusters cutting through the stillness, growing louder by the second. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they weren't here for a friendly visit. Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Who's coming?" His voice was barely a whisper, but the words still felt like they hung heavy in the air between them. Zalara's face remained unreadable, but her eyes, those intense, alien eyes, flickered with a hint of something that wasn't quite fear, but a wariness he hadn't seen before. "Not who," she corrected. "What?" Before Mark could ask anything else, the low hum of the engines outside grew louder, more distinct. Heavy footsteps echoed, each one reverberating through the cave as if something, or someone, was coming closer. "They've found us." Zalara's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her tone. She moved quickly, glancing at the scanner that still hummed faintly on the pedestal. It had gone silent, but the symbols on its surface were now glowing erratically, shifting with chaotic speed. Mark's heart began to race as he followed her, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He felt like he was moving in slow motion, each step more difficult than the last. His side throbbed in protest, the wound from the crash still fresh, but the adrenaline pumping through him kept him going. Zalara didn't break stride as she led him toward the back of the cave. She moved with the precision of someone who had done this many times before, who had been in situations like this more times than she cared to admit. But even she was tense now. Mark could see it in the way her ears flicked with every sound, in the way her eyes darted to every shadow, as if she were expecting danger to leap out at any moment. They reached the back of the cave, where the walls seemed to open up into a narrow tunnel. The air smelled different here, heavier, like it had been untouched for centuries. "This is our only way out," Zalara said, her voice barely audible as she took a step into the tunnel. Mark hesitated, glancing back toward the cave entrance. The rumble of engines had stopped, replaced by the eerie sound of metallic footsteps. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, was moving in on them. Fast. Without waiting for him to respond, Zalara grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him into the darkened passageway. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the soft ground beneath their feet. They had only gone a few meters when Mark heard it, the sound of metal scraping against rock, the unmistakable sound of something large and heavy making its way through the narrow passage. It was closing in on them. "Run!" Zalara hissed, her voice low and sharp. She was already several steps ahead, but Mark hesitated for a moment, panic rising in his chest. They had to get out. They couldn't stay here. Mark forced himself to move, pushing through the pain in his side as he sprinted after her. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls narrowing as they went deeper. There were no sounds now, only the heavy thudding of their footsteps as they ran for their lives. Suddenly, they came to a dead end, a large, solid wall of rock blocking their path. Mark's heart dropped into his stomach. "Zalara," he gasped. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" Zalara was already at the wall, her hands moving quickly over the surface. She didn't respond to him, her focus entirely on the stone in front of her. Mark stepped forward, staring at her, confused. "This isn't good," Mark muttered under his breath. "I don't suppose you've got a handy alien escape pod stashed away in your back pocket, do you?" Zalara's ears twitched as she paused, looking over her shoulder at him. "Actually, yes," she said, her voice cool. "And it's just ahead. But we need to move quickly." Before Mark could ask what she meant, Zalara pressed her palm against the rock. There was a soft click, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden passageway. Mark's eyes widened. "How did you—" "No time," Zalara interrupted, her voice strained. "Get in." Without waiting for him, she stepped into the new tunnel, her staff glowing brightly in the dim light. Mark didn't need any more encouragement. He quickly followed her, slipping through the opening just as the distant sound of engines rumbled again, this time much closer. Whoever was following them was getting closer. They moved through the dark tunnel, which twisted and turned, leading them down a slope that seemed to drop into the heart of the moon. The walls here were different, smooth and metallic, with faint ancient symbols carved into the surfaces. It felt like they were entering the belly of something far older than they could possibly understand. Finally, they emerged into a wide cavern, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. There, in the center of the cavern, stood a ship. It wasn't like anything Mark had ever seen before. It was ancient, worn down by time and the harsh environment of the moon. The ship's hull was battered and scarred, its once glossy surface now dulled and weathered. But despite its age, it exuded an undeniable presence, an energy that made Mark feel like he was standing before something alive. "What is this?" Mark whispered, his voice full of awe. "This," Zalara said, her voice hushed, "is our only chance." Mark stepped closer, still processing everything. The ship had clearly been abandoned for years, maybe longer. Its dilapidated controls and broken systems told the story of a forgotten past, but it still stood there, waiting. "We're flying this?" Mark asked incredulously. "This thing's barely held together." Zalara shot him a look. "You wanted a spaceship, didn't you?" Mark's gaze turned back to the ship, feeling both awed and terrified by the sight of it. He didn't understand how, but it was clear that this ship was their only way out of here. The hunters were closing in, and whatever was left of their pursuers would be on them soon. Zalara stepped toward the ship, her staff humming with energy as she made her way to the control panel. "It can still fly, but only if we hurry." Mark's heart raced. His mind swam with the possibilities of what could go wrong, but he didn't have time to think about it. The sound of metallic footsteps echoed louder, reverberating through the cavern. "We need to move now," Zalara said sharply, her voice filled with urgency. Mark didn't hesitate. He followed her into the ancient ship, the hatch closing behind them with a final, metallic clunk. Inside, the ship was a chaotic mix of dilapidated technology and ancient alien systems. Panels flickered weakly, lights dimmed and flickered on and off. But despite the decay, something about the ship felt alive, as though it were waking up. "All right, let's make this thing fly," Mark muttered, trying to steady his shaking hands as he sat down at the control console. Zalara moved gracefully to a console on the other side, quickly working with the ship's systems. Mark followed her lead, trying to make sense of the controls, his hands slipping across alien buttons and levers. Nothing about this ship made sense. It was a miracle it was still intact. "Hold on," Zalara said, her voice sharp. "We're not out of danger yet." Mark glanced up. Outside, the shadows moved closer. The hunters were almost there. The ancient ship shuddered as the engines roared to life, its hull groaning under the strain of years of neglect. Mark's hands were tight on the controls, his fingers slipping against the unfamiliar alien interface. The console flickered in a way that suggested it was barely holding itself together, but it was enough to keep them moving. Come on, Mark muttered under his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The ship lurched forward, but it wasn't graceful. It was more like a wounded animal trying to run. From behind them, the hunters were closing in. He could feel them, like shadows creeping ever closer. Their missiles had already grazed the hull, and Mark knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up. Zalara's voice cut through the tension. "We need to reach the Fold Gate. It's the only way we can escape them." "The Fold Gate? What's that?" Mark asked, his mind spinning as he tried to make sense of the controls. His body still ached from the crash, his side throbbing with every movement. Zalara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved quickly to another console, her fingers dancing across the unfamiliar alien symbols with practiced ease. "A rift in space," she said, her tone calm, even though there was a dangerous edge to her words. "It's a passage between dimensions. We'll be able to lose them there." Mark blinked, staring at her. "Wait. So, you're telling me we're about to jump through a wormhole, a rift in space? Are you sure that's a good idea?" Zalara's eyes flicked toward him, her expression unreadable. "It's the only chance we have." Mark's stomach tightened, and he forced himself to focus on the controls. There was no going back now. The hunters were closing in, their sleek ships almost upon them. The only way out was forward. With a deep hum, the ship's engines kicked into higher gear, the force of the acceleration pushing Mark back into his seat. The stars outside the viewport stretched and blurred as they gained speed, but Mark could feel it. An oppressive weight pressing down on them, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to bend. "Get ready," Zalara said, her voice tinged with something like anticipation. "The Fold Gate is just ahead." Mark's grip tightened. His heart raced, and his mind struggled to keep up with the overwhelming sense of unknown. They were about to breach the boundaries of space and time, and he had no idea what would happen when they did. But he had no choice. The Fold Gate appeared ahead, a swirling mass of distorted light and color, unlike anything Mark had ever seen. It wasn't a neat, controlled wormhole. It was more like a tear in the fabric of reality itself, chaotic and unstable, pulsing with an eerie glow that seemed to pulse with life. "Hold on!" Zalara shouted, her voice urgent now. Mark braced himself as the ship surged forward, the Fold Gate growing larger with every passing second. The walls of the ship creaked and groaned, the ancient systems straining as they pushed the vessel faster and faster. Mark's pulse raced, his breath shallow as they hurtled toward the unknown. Just as the ship reached the threshold of the Fold Gate, there was a violent shudder. The hull groaned under the pressure, and the console flashed red. Mark's heart skipped a beat as the systems began to overload. "What the hell is happening?" he shouted, trying to maintain control. Zalara didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the Fold Gate, her fingers moving quickly across the controls. She wasn't just flying the ship. She was directing it, guiding them through the chaotic rift with a level of control Mark couldn't comprehend. "Brace yourself!" Zalara ordered. With a final surge, the ship plunged into the Fold Gate, everything bent and twisted around them. Mark's stomach lurched as the stars outside the viewport stretched, swirling into colors that didn't exist in any known spectrum. The very concept of time and space seemed to collapse, folding in on itself as the ship tore through the rift. He could feel his mind stretching too, the sensation of something trying to break through his senses, something ancient, vast, and unknowable. For a split second, he thought he saw a shadow, a dark form, slip past the edges of his vision, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The ship's systems screamed at him, the alarms blaring in his ears. The pulse reader, the one that Zalara had placed on his chest earlier, flashed brightly, and for the first time, Mark felt it shift inside him, vibrating with a strange energy. The core seed was awakening, its power fusing with his, reaching into the very core of his being. He could feel it now, the connection to something far beyond him. Then, with a final pulse, everything stilled. The ship jerked violently, throwing Mark against the restraints, but then the calm returned. The rift was gone. The stars outside the viewport were normal once more, a cold expanse of glittering lights stretching into eternity. The fold gate had closed behind them, leaving nothing but the cold, endless void ahead. Mark exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were still gripping the controls, but his body was tense with the aftershock of the jump. He looked over at Zalara, who was silent, her eyes glowing faintly as she studied the ship's systems. "We made it," he said, his voice hoarse. Zalara didn't respond right away. Her eyes were fixed on the controls, but Mark could sense the weight of the moment between them. This wasn't over yet. "We've only bought ourselves time," Zalara said softly, her voice low and serious. "The hunters will find us. They always do." Mark's stomach dropped. "Then we need to keep moving. What now?" Zalara turned to him, her gaze steady. "Now, we go to the source." Mark blinked. "The source?" She nodded, her expression unreadable. "The first seed. The original core. It's our only hope now." Mark stared at her, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He didn't understand it all, but one thing was clear. Whatever was happening, he was no longer just a stranded engineer. He was now part of something much larger. And the universe was watching. Mark couldn't take his eyes off the shadow looming in the distance. It was like the very fabric of space itself had been distorted, bending around the immense shape that seemed to blot out the stars. The thing was massive, far too large to be a ship, and for a moment Mark wondered if it was something alive, something ancient and forgotten. His heart raced as the ship hummed softly beneath him, the steady beat of the engines a cruel contrast to the rising tension. Zalara didn't seem to notice Mark's growing unease. She was absorbed in the ship's controls, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light as her fingers danced across the alien interface. Her focus was razor-sharp, every motion deliberate. Mark could sense the weight of something greater than themselves hanging in the air. She wasn't just flying the ship, she was guiding them toward something that could change everything. Finally, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. "We need to go deeper." Mark blinked, his mind racing. Deeper? Into that? He pointed toward the dark mass looming ahead. Is that what I think it is?" Zalara nodded slowly, her voice serious. "That is Echo Prime, the source of all the core seeds. It is the place where Venerians first learned how to split thought from flesh, how to evolve into something greater, something beyond time. And now, it's the only way we can stop the hunters." Mark's stomach churned. "And you think we're supposed to just go there, after everything that's happened?" Zalara met his gaze. "We don't have a choice. The hunters are relentless. They won't stop until they find us, and they will. But the source core, it's different. It can give us the power we need to fight them." Mark swallowed, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no idea what this source core was, but it sounded like nothing he'd ever encountered. He was just a guy who fixed machines for a living, not some hero. But there was no denying the pull of something greater. Something in the air, in the ship, in the connection to the core seed that had been bonded to him. Something inside him had awakened, and he could feel it. It was alive, pulsing with energy beyond his comprehension. The ship crept forward, its engines humming with quiet power as they neared the shadow of Echo Prime. Mark could see it now. This monolithic structure, part cathedral, part neural cluster, wrapped in crystal and memory. It loomed in space, its form a twisted mess of jagged shapes and fractals that seemed to shift and change with every glance. "That thing, it's like it's not even real," Mark whispered, his voice full of awe. Zalara's voice was low, almost reverent. "It's real, but it is also more than real. It exists in a state beyond our understanding. That is why the hunters seek it. They want its power, its knowledge, but they cannot control it. Only those who are chosen can." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Chosen? You mean, like, me?" Zalara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped a series of controls, and the ship lurched forward, entering the strange, distorted space around Echo Prime. The ship's systems flickered, and Mark felt an eerie pulling sensation, as if the very fabric of reality was twisting around them. His mind felt dizzy, like he was no longer sure what was up or down. The ship's hull groaned as they passed through the rift's turbulent currents, the external environment warping and stretching like a piece of rubber. He clutched the seat, trying to steady himself, but the sensation only deepened. He could feel the core seed inside him responding, its power growing stronger, thrumming like a heartbeat beneath his skin. It was as though something deep inside him was awakening, something ancient, something alien. "This is it," Zalara said, her voice breaking through the swirling chaos outside. "We are at the threshold, but we must be careful. The source core has its own sentience. It will test us." Mark nodded, though his mind was still reeling. "What do you mean, test us? I don't exactly feel ready for any tests. Can't I just push a button and get a pass?" Zalara's lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "No, the source tests not just your mind, but your spirit, your worth." With a final surge, the ship passed through the outer gates of Echo Prime. They were inside now, a vast, hollow chamber that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls, if you could even call them that, were made of shifting crystals and fractals, constantly changing shapes as if the very structure of the place was alive. The air was thick with energy, and Mark could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. In the center of the room, suspended in mid-air, was the source core. It was larger than anything Mark could have imagined, a glowing mass, shifting and swirling with brilliant light. Its form was constantly changing, flickering with patterns that defied all logic, like it was both real and not real at the same time. Mark couldn't look at it for too long without feeling a sense of overwhelm, like his mind was trying to comprehend something far beyond its capacity. "It's beautiful," Mark whispered, awe in his voice. Zalara didn't respond. She simply stepped forward, her long ears flicking with a strange resonance, as if the core was calling to her. "This is where everything began. And this," she said, her voice quieter, almost reverent, "is where it will end." Mark stepped forward, but something strange happened. The core seed inside him pulsed more strongly, and the air around him grew thicker, almost oppressive. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in, the fractals swirling faster. The core's energy seemed to draw nearer, like it was reaching for him. It felt as if it were testing him, probing his very being. He could hear a faint, whispering voice, but when he tried to focus on it, the words dissolved into an incomprehensible hum. He staggered back, his head spinning. "Zalara!" he gasped, his voice tight. "What's happening?" Zalara turned to him, her eyes wide and glowing with a soft intensity. "It has chosen you, Mark Avery," she said, her voice a low whisper. "The Source has seen your potential, your worth. You are more than just a human engineer. You are part of something greater, something beyond." Before Mark could respond, a bright flash of light burst from the source core, and the world around him shifted. He felt as if his very being was being pulled apart, his mind unraveling, expanding into something vast and limitless. He saw visions, memories that weren't his own, whole civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye. He felt the weight of time and space pushing down on him, and for a fleeting moment he understood. He understood everything. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light receded. Mark staggered back, gasping for breath, his hands trembling as he reached out to steady himself. He could still feel the weight of the source core's presence inside him, the energy thrumming beneath his skin, still alive, still pulsing with power. What just happened? Mark whispered, his voice shaking. Zalara stepped forward, her face filled with something like awe and fear. "You've been changed, Mark. You've been elevated." The ship's alarm blared again, more insistent this time. The flashing red lights filled the cockpit, casting an eerie glow across the shattered control panel. Mark could feel the weight of the source core inside him, still thrumming, still alive. But now it was mixed with a rising sense of urgency. Something was coming. Something far worse than they had ever faced. "Zalara, what's happening?" Mark's voice was tight with panic, but he forced himself to stay focused, gripping the control panel to steady himself. Zalara didn't answer immediately. Her long ears flicked in response to a sound Mark couldn't hear. Her eyes narrowed as she turned, scanning the readouts on the console with an intensity that made Mark feel like an amateur in the presence of a master. "They've found us," she said, her voice low and almost resigned. "The hunters. They've tracked us to Echo Prime." Mark's heart sank. "Are you telling me we're trapped in a ship that's held together with duct tape, about to face a group of space zealots who think I'm some kind of cosmic anomaly?" Zalara didn't flinch at his sarcasm, but there was a flash of something, amusement, in her eyes. "Not exactly, but it's close enough." Mark clenched his fists, feeling the tension tighten in his chest. This was it. They had come this far, only to be cornered by the very hunters who had been chasing them. The thought of escaping through another fold gate, or jumping into some other unknown, barely seemed like an option anymore. "Do we have any backup plans?" he asked, hoping for an ounce of good news. But Zalara's expression remained solemn. "Not unless you can suddenly summon an army from nowhere," she replied, the words almost dry. "We need to get to the source, the heart of Echo Prime. It's the only place we can hide." Mark stared at her, his mind racing. "And how do you propose we get there? The hunters are right on top of us." Zalara took a deep breath, her posture shifting, becoming even more resolute. "We'll fight them." Mark blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. "Fight them? With what? A broken spaceship and your sarcasm?" Zalara's lips twitched slightly, but it wasn't a smile. She was focused, calculating. "Not just me. You too." Mark was about to protest, but something inside him, the energy of the source core, shifted again, like a pulse through his very being. He could feel it now, vibrating in his veins, thrumming through his chest like a second heartbeat. The power was there, but it wasn't fully under his control yet. It felt like an extension of himself, and yet it was something else entirely. I can feel it," Mark said, his voice lower now, almost reverent. "The core seed. It's not just energy. It's me, somehow." Zalara's eyes flicked toward him, a flash of something unreadable in them. "You've only begun to understand it. It will take time." "And if we don't have time?" Mark asked, his gaze locked on hers. Zalara didn't hesitate. "Then we make time." With that, she turned toward the central control panel, and Mark followed, suddenly aware of the ship's urgent need for attention. The hunters were closing in, their ships now visible on the view screen, sleek and dark, like shadows in space, each one bristling with weapons. They had to act, and fast. The ship's systems hummed with power as Zalara adjusted the controls, her hands steady, precise. The ship lurched forward as it moved out of the hollow within Echo Prime, the crystalline walls of the structure fading into the distance. The hunters were on their tail now, close enough that Mark could almost hear the whine of their missiles as they cut through space. "All right, buckle up," Zalara said, her voice sharp with determination. "We're going in for the heart of Echo Prime. I'll need you to follow my lead." Mark took a deep breath. He had no idea what he was about to do, but somehow it didn't matter. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. The core seed had changed him. He was more than he had been. "You ready?" Zalara asked, glancing back at him. Mark looked at her, feeling the weight of the moment. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been. And for the first time since the crash, Mark Avery realized that he wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something greater, something unimaginable. "I've got your back," he said, his voice steady, his heart pounding. "Let's do this." Zalara nodded once, and with that she pushed the ship into full throttle. The ship surged forward, weaving through the twisting, fractured architecture of Echo Prime. The hunters pursued them relentlessly, their ships moving with deadly precision, their weapons primed. Mark could feel the pulse of the source core inside him, urging him forward, urging him to fight. "Steady!" Zalara's voice crackled over the comms. "We're heading for the central core. The hunters will be there too, but we need to get in before they can stop us." The rift echo bucked beneath them as it sliced through the distorted structures of Echo Prime, dodging blasts and missile fire. Mark gripped the controls, his mind racing as he tried to steady the ship. The core seed inside him was pulsing again, stronger now, more alive than ever. It was like a current running through his veins, urging him to act. He focused on the ship's controls, feeling a strange connection to the vessel, like the ship itself was responding to him. The pulse reader in his hand flared with a brilliant glow as he concentrated, his focus tightening. Mark's heart beat faster as he realized what was happening. The core seed had bonded with him. It wasn't just a source of power, it was part of him now. And as long as he could focus, he could command it. He could control the ship. Just as they neared the central core, a massive energy blast erupted from behind them. The ship lurched violently, and Mark was thrown against the controls. The hunters weren't giving up. "Zalara!" Mark shouted, his voice rising in panic. "We can't outrun them!" Zalara's eyes flicked toward him, her expression grim. "We don't have to outrun them," she said, her voice filled with deadly calm. "We just need to outlast them." The ship hurtled forward, the central core of Echo Prime growing larger with every second. Mark's hands tightened on the controls, and for the first time, he understood. The source core wasn't just a tool, it was a bridge between him and the universe itself. And if he could learn to wield it, he could shape the outcome of their fate. But the hunters weren't backing down, and the final test was just ahead.